Hi, and welcome back to Why Intolerance and Extremism Happen and What We Can Do About All the Anger and Division. I'm Teri Kanefield. Thank you for joining me. This is part 5. Last time, I talked about how, in a very short time, we moved far away from the founding conditions. I offered the incels as an example of how rapid changes can trigger backlashes and extreme movements. I've been talking about the history of laws in the United States, but the same principles apply anytime rapid change disrupts the status quo. Sudden changes will please some people while alarming others. Sometimes sudden changes can ignite extremist movements. Now it's time to talk about why democratic forms of government are difficult and how that very difficulty often drives people toward extremism or authoritarianism. Democracy can never be completely stable. One reason is that progressives are always trying to push us forward, while regressives are always trying to push us backward. We will always have a push and pull because people are different with different desires and different fears. Also, as I talked about in the last section, in a democracy, you can't outlaw ideas you think are dangerous or deviant. If you succeed in policing ideas, you end up with a totalitarian state, which sort of defeats the purpose. Even on a small local scale, people push in different directions. If you don't believe me, run for local office and try to get something done. It took my community years to get a much-needed traffic light. Yes, many voters opposed the traffic light, even though you could see with your own eyes that people, including kids, waited for a break in the traffic and then darted across 4 lanes because they didn't want to walk a mile to the nearest light. Can you guess which side of the traffic light issue I was on? Whatever you suggest, no matter how sensible it seems to you, there will always be opposition. That's why a large, sprawling, representative democracy like the United States, consisting of hundreds of separate jurisdictions and lots of bureaucracies to administer all the regulations, resembles a tangled ball of yarn. As Professor Andriy Chirovsky said, democracy is messy. Authoritarianism is neat. Some people cannot tolerate the complexity, the messiness, and the give and take of democracy. They long for order. They want people to be the same. They want their way all the time. My way or the highway is autocracy. They want rapid change, which can happen in an autocracy. Autocracies offer order. There is structure. People don't pull in different directions because it isn't permitted. Everyone knows their place. In an autocracy, you can feel reassured that others think as you do, and if they don't, they keep their views to themselves. As opposed to a tangled ball of yarn, autocracies resemble neat lines in a row. Ideologies also resemble neat lines in a row. This is because ideologies and autocracies have a lot in common. For an autocracy to function, a controlling ideology is essential. Enough people need an unshakable belief that the autocrat has a unique, perhaps divine, or certainly special, power to save the nation. Autocrats say things like, I and I alone can fix it. For most people, life in an autocracy goes on. They get up in the morning, they have their coffee, they go to work, they take care of their families. The differences are that in an autocracy, you don't criticize the leader, you do what you're told to do, you believe or pretend to believe what you're told to believe, and you know if you get into trouble, you cannot count on help from the government. People living in autocracies often avoid talking about politics altogether. Here's the catch. Autocracies are not stable either. Eventually, autocracies topple. A personalist dictatorship has a particular vulnerability: uncertainty about the succession. In Russia, for example, nobody knows what will happen when Vladimir Putin dies. Personalist rulers often avoid designating a successor or creating a succession mechanism out of fear of losing control. They're afraid the successor will consolidate power while they are still alive. Not designating a successor keeps rivals uncertain and vying for the personalist ruler's favor. Monarchies and family dynasties are more stable because the heir is the monarch's offspring and the king or queen can generally count on his or her own son or daughter not to bump them off to acquire power. Moreover, being the son or daughter of the king or queen is lovely enough so that the heir is generally content to wait. Monarchy, however, has its own serious flaws. Suppose, for example, the king's son is a nutcase. A representative democracy, in theory, creates a meritocracy because voters can, although they often do not, vote for the most competent leaders. What we might call the existence pain of democracies is that they are always difficult. Because rule of law is cumbersome, change is painfully slow. This is intentional. Our Constitution makes change difficult to create stability. When change happens rapidly, you have to deal with the backlash or temporary instability as people get used to the changes. James Madison wrote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If we were angels, democracy would also work perfectly, but then we wouldn't need a government in the first place." One reason progress was slow for 200 years in the United States is that for most of our history, we have had a very conservative Supreme Court. Then, for a brief period beginning in the 1950s, we had a liberal court. If you don't doubt that for most of our history, the Supreme Court has been extremely conservative, perhaps even reactionary, consider these cases. Dred Scott versus Sandford, 1857. The majority of justices held that a person whose ancestors were imported into the United States and sold as slaves, whether now enslaved or free, could not be an American citizen and therefore did not have standing to sue in federal court. In addition, the court held that the special rights and immunities granted to citizens do not apply to them. The court also added that enslaved persons were property under the Fifth Amendment and that any law that would deprive a slave owner of that property was unconstitutional. It took a civil war to undo that one. In 1883, the Supreme Court effectively overturned the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which prohibited racial discrimination in public accommodations like hotels, restaurants, and transportation. The Supreme Court, in an 8-1 decision, held that Congress could not regulate private business. That decision helped usher in a long period of racial discrimination. And then there was Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. This was when the Supreme Court held that separate facilities do not violate the 14th Amendment. This was the case that legalized segregation on public transportation. Oh, and then there's Lochner versus New York, 1905. The Supreme Court overturned a law limiting bakery work hours to 10 hours per day, saying it was unconstitutional. The court found an implied liberty of contract in the Due Process Clause. In other words, the court said that under the freedom to enter contracts, if someone's willing to work for pennies per day, the government has no authority to step in. There was also the time the Supreme Court said that the federal income tax was unconstitutional. We needed a constitutional amendment to fix that one. Oh, and how about the time the Supreme Court upheld the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II? And the time the Supreme Court said Georgia had the right to criminalize gay and lesbian relationships. The list goes on. Mostly, the Supreme Court has been conservative. There are a few exceptions, most notably the Warren Court of the 1950s and 60s, which gave us Brown v. Board of Education, which ushered in the Civil Rights Movement. The liberal Warren Court happened partly because FDR served just over 12 years in office and appointed a bunch of justices. Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren, to the horror of some and the delight of others. Earl Warren, who appeared on paper to be a strong conservative, embraced liberal values once he put on his black robes and knew he had a lifetime appointment so he could do what he wanted. The early Burger Court was also liberal. They gave us Roe v. Wade. In Roe v. Wade, the court found that the Constitution included an implied right to privacy, and that right included the right to an abortion, with exceptions. As you might expect, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was not on the court at the time, was happy with the result. However, she believed the court used the wrong reasoning. She said the court should have decided the case under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, instead of the idea that the Constitution contains an implied right of privacy. Of course, the chief complaint of social conservatives was that the Constitution says nothing at all about abortion or privacy rights, so how can the Constitution protect those rights? They accused the Supreme Court of making up law instead of interpreting the law. The social conservatives also argued that there's nothing in the Constitution that gives the federal government the power to tell private restaurants who they can serve. They accused these courts of judicial activism, by which they meant making up stuff that the drafters of the Constitution never intended. In the 1970s, in response to the liberal courts of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, a theory of constitutional interpretation arose called Originalism. Originalism holds that a law or legal text should be interpreted as it was intended by the original drafters. Now, this makes sense for law enforcement officers who should always try to figure out the lawmaker's intention because under the separation of powers doctrine, the job of the enforcement officer is to carry out the legislative intent. However, interpreting the Constitution as originally intended in 1789 enables regression because the Constitution was written by white Protestant men who deliberately left out everyone else. To illustrate how the theory of originalism has been used as a means for taking us backward, I will offer a brief history of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment was drafted by enslavers who were afraid that a strong federal government would disarm or outlaw local militias. This was important to them because local militias were necessary to control the enslaved population. The discussion about the need for the Second Amendment began in the Virginia State House when Virginian leaders were debating whether to ratify the Constitution. The delegates were enslavers who were worried about whether the federal government would take away their guns, which meant no way of controlling the enslaved population. George Mason contemplated the fact that the new Constitution gave the federal government control over armies and militias. He said this, "The militia may here be destroyed by that method which has been practiced in other parts of the world before, that is, by rendering them useless by disarming them. Without armed militias to control the enslaved population, these men knew just what would happen." Patrick Henry came right out and said what was on everyone's mind. First, he said that locally controlled militias were, quote, their ultimate safety. He reminded the audience that slavery was detested everywhere, and he suggested that the federal government's power to call up militias could be used to end slavery. Yeah, this is the guy who also said, "Give me liberty or give me death." He pointed out that the federal government could abolish slavery anytime by simply calling the state's black men into military service and then setting them free. I wrote about all this, by the way, in more detail in my recent book on the Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment was drafted by James Madison, who attended the meeting. The Second Amendment, as ratified, says this: "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." For most of our history, the phrase, "a well-regulated militia," was interpreted literally to mean that the states and local governments could organize militias. The NRA, the National Rifle Association, was founded in 1871 by General George Wingate, a general in the Union Army, and Colonel William C. Church, a journalist who volunteered to serve in the Union Army. They formed the NRA because they were appalled by the terrible marksmanship of Union soldiers. At the time, there was very little training for soldiers. Soldiers were expected to bring their own guns and come prepared to fight. Wingate and Church saw themselves as training and preparing future American soldiers. The NRA was therefore founded as a gun safety and marksmanship training organization. For the first century of the NRA's existence, the organization was politically neutral, supporting both gun rights and safety regulations. In the 1970s, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, the NRA underwent an ideological shift. In 1977, there was a power struggle within the NRA between the old guard and a more radical faction. The power struggle erupted in what's been called the Cincinnati Revolt. The NRA leadership was taken over by a group that advocated for unrestricted access to firearms. They advanced the idea that the Second Amendment protected an individual's right to own guns, not just a collective right tied to militia service. The idea has been adopted by modern militia movements. Modern militias believe that the federal government has become unwieldy and tyrannical. They believe that, as a result of the changing demographics, the federal government no longer represents their interests. They embrace what has been called the insurrection theory of the Second Amendment, which states that the Second Amendment protects the unconditional right to bear arms for self-defense, and that includes defense against a tyrannical government. Thomas Jefferson once said, "A little rebellion now and then is a good thing." The idea is that when governments become too tyrannical, people should rebel. So yes, many of these armed militias believe that they have the right to armed resistance against the federal government if the federal government becomes tyrannical. After all, they say, isn't that sort of what the Revolutionary War was about? So yes, many of these armed militias believe that they have the right to armed resistance against the federal government if the federal government becomes tyrannical. Recall that the federal government was the driver of the major changes of the 50s through the 70s. In other words, these militias are another extremist reaction to the rapid changes. White power militias looked at the changing demographics and put forward a theory called Great Replacement or white genocide. This theory holds that there's a deliberate plot to replace or diminish the power of white people in Western countries through non-white immigration. They are determined to fight what they call white genocide. Meanwhile, as these militias were forming and arming themselves, the new NRA leadership was busy doing grassroots organizing, including working to elect politicians who support the idea that the Second Amendment protects the rights of individuals to own guns. By 2008, the Supreme Court had taken a sharp turn to the right. 7 of the justices had been appointed by Republicans. That was the year the Supreme Court decided the landmark case of District of Columbia versus Heller. 5 of the conservative justices held that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to own guns. Here is their argument. In the 18th century, militia members were expected to provide their own guns. Therefore, the right for governments to form militias included the right for individuals to own guns. Therefore, the Second Amendment was intended to protect the rights of individuals to own guns. Of course, soldiers today don't provide their own guns, but the Originalism theory says that the Second Amendment must be interpreted as intended by the 18th century men who drafted it. I'll note, however, that the Supreme Court stopped short of adopting the NRA's view that there must be unlimited access to gun ownership. The court said that the right is not unlimited. They allowed for reasonable regulations. One thing you can see in the push-pull dynamics is this. Progressives push us forward, and then regressives push us backward, but the regressives never push us all the way back. Holding something steady, the job of conservatives, is much easier than undoing things and pushing backward. Once new amendments and regulatory agencies are in place, getting rid of them is difficult. That's why progressives steadily, although often very slowly, gain ground. Psychiatrist M. Scott Peck, in his book, The Road Less Traveled, said this: "Life is difficult. This is a great truth, one of the greatest truths. It's a great truth because once we see this truth, we transcend it. Once we know that life is difficult, once we truly understand and accept it, then life is no longer difficult. Because once it's accepted, the fact that life is difficult no longer matters." He explains that once we understand that life is difficult, we stop moaning about it and we get to work solving problems as they arise. The same thing can be said about democratic forms of government. Democracy is always difficult. Once we understand this, we stop being shocked each time there's a setback and we set to work looking for solutions. I think I'll stop here In the next section, I'll continue with why democracy is always in danger, and then I will move into the idea that extremism requires that people be carefully taught. Thank you for listening. I hope you'll join me again.